Good evening, and welcome to another edition of What Do You Think? My name is Bill Morse. I'm your host, and we are on the air every Thursday from 5:45 to 6:30. And just so you know, and while I'm thinking of it, next week the program will be pre-recorded, so you won't have an opportunity to call in. As you probably already know, this is a call-in program. People are welcome to call in using the Zoom phone number, the connection number that's listed at the bottom of the screen shortly. And after our intro, I have a special treat for our intro. Let's see. First of all, we have a caller, and I want to welcome that person in first. Hey, Kurt.
Hello there.
Very good. I'm glad you were able to make it, and I hope you were not driving too much over the speed limit in going from work back to the house.
So. Yeah, and not only that, it's raining like crazy here. 12 hours. We're going to get the fringe of in fact, the lightning's going on right now.
Oh, boy.
So, yeah, I got home quick.
Okay, and safely. Very good.
Yeah.
So I was just saying to everyone that next week is going to be pre-recorded. I have to go down to Philadelphia and pick up Oliver and Carla and bring them back. So it's going to be pre-recorded. I don't know. We'll see. We should talk about when we're going to get together, when it's possible. I know you're busy, but anyway, we can talk later. I was just telling everybody that we're going to open with something that was sent to me. It's a short music video in which the performer is a street musician. He's Turkish. He does drum work. And he's performing in a park, and I'm assuming by the background that it's somewhere in Turkey, perhaps Ankara or outside of Istanbul. He's performing a Finnish folk song that centers on a dance at a wedding. And it's very catchy.
That doesn't surprise me.
No.
Because Finnish and Turkish are related.
You know what? That makes sense because I don't know if the musician's name is Bilal Guregen, if I'm accenting it correctly. Bilal Guregen. And Bilal, as far as I know, just speaks Turkish. Perhaps he knows enough of the lyrics because he says the lyrics. He sings the song while he's drumming it. And part of the song is gibberish. It's like make-believe language. And part of it, of course, is Finnish. And it deals, as I said, with a wedding song in which a girl, a young lady, I should say, at a wedding party dances with a man, and they click. And the young lady and the man go back to the young woman's house, and the mother is waiting, and she's not too happy about her daughter's choice for a date, let alone marriage. And the young man says, I'm going to take your daughter away, and we're going to be a match, whether you like it or not. The lyrics I found in English, they're kind of saucy. The guy's kind of impertinent. He has a lot of cheek. And I'm not sure if that's typical in Finnish folk songs, or if something gets lost in the translation, because obviously it's a translation by somebody from Finnish to English. But I thought it was remarkable that Bilal, who's Turkish, a street musician, and also he's blind. He's been blind since birth, is able to perform this folk song and do it so well. So if everybody is ready behind the glass, we can play that video.
Bayram Boynu Kara'nın hazırlayıp sunduğu, Bilal Göregen'in konuk olduğu, seyircilerin eşlik ettiği, YouTube'a özel müzik faslı başlıyor. Müziğin dehası Bilal. Yürü be. Allah'ına. Merhaba sevgili YouTube kullanıcıları. Uzun bir aradan sonra yine bir videoyla daha karşınızdayız. Eğer siz de bu videomuzu beğenirseniz videomuza beğen butonuna basabilir, paylaşabilir ve abone olmadıysanız kanalımıza abone olabilirsiniz. Dong 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 dong
Hear that.
I did.
Okay, good. And so were the rest of the audience members tuned in. Again, someone sent it to me, not in that format. It was sent as a video of older men dancing to folk music. One man would go out and do the dance, and they were, in this video, they were mimes, or not mimes, but they were memes in which the old men had been replaced by certain political figures. It was interesting. Anyway, that aside, the music caught my attention, and then I looked into where the music came from. I thought it was some type of Balkan folk music. And lo and behold, I found the name is Levin Polka, Levin, L-E-V-A-N, L-E-V-A-N, Levin Polka. Polka is spelled with 2 Ks, and it's actually Finnish in origin from the 1800s, a Finnish folk song. And as we were talking about before, it's about a wedding dance and a budding love affair between a young woman and young men who were attending that wedding festival. But I was intrigued by Bilal Gurigan's performance using the drums, and he was a street musician. I don't think he's had I think that's his main source of income. It definitely is now, because he's done very well, and he also performs other forms of folk music, both from his native Turkey and from other countries. So you have a chance, look up his name, Bilal Gurigan, B-I-L-A-L, that's his first name, Bilal, and Gurigan, G-O-R-E-G-E-N, G-O-R-E-G-E-N, Bilal Gurigan. And a very talented young man, and a sense of, they say that if you lose a certain ability, you pick up more in another ability. This man has lost his sight, or has been sightless all his adult life. And so he has something else that is a gift to offer to other people. But anyway, that I thought would be a different introduction. Any comment on that, Kurt?
Well, it was different. It sounds very Arabic. In fact, what he was playing sounds like a tabla.
Tabla.
Yeah, if that's Finnish, boy, that really has an Arabic influence.
And again, half of the lyrics are gibberish. They don't mean anything in any language. They're just there for the sound to aid in the rhythm and of the texture of the music. So I don't know. I think it's pretty incredible to learn a song in another language enough to perform it in public, but it's and still tell a story. There is a story behind the lyrics. So anyway, the main part of tonight's program, I put down on the schedule that there is. We're going to talk about a Cold War connection between the town of Cavendish, Vermont, which is Cavendish is on the way to Rutland from Bellows Falls. If you drive towards Rutland, you normally go through Chester, then up through Proctorsville. If you take a right and leave 103 and go east, probably 5 miles, I'm guessing, you wind up in the town of Cavendish, which is on the Black River. And Cavendish, for almost 20 years, had a rather famous resident who was living in exile. And it's an interesting story. Kurt, do you have any idea who I'm talking about?
I do not.
All right, I'll give you a few more hints. He was a dissident from a communist bloc country. And
Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Very good, you get the prize. Yes.
Yeah, you have to give me a hint there.
Yeah, I found this out. I'm trying to think of how I originally got onto this track. But I read something. I've started looking at historical figures that have some kind of connection with Vermont because the studio and the audience is in Vermont and New Hampshire. And so Solzhenitsyn and his family lived in Cavendish from roughly 1976 to 1990. I'm going to say 1998. 1998. No, I'm wrong. 1994. Somebody can always fact check me. But yes, he lived from in Cavendish from 1976, the bicentennial year, until 1992. And just a little brief background. As you've mentioned, he wrote his first published novel, and this was published actually in the Soviet Union with Nikita Khrushchev's thumbs up. Because Kurt, as I'm sure you know, after Joseph Stalin died with a little help from his friends, wink wink, in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became premier. Nikita Khrushchev, who had a background as a patriot during the Great Patriot War, he was an officer in the Red Army and rose up through the ranks. He was actually, as you probably know, peasant stock, kind of a country boy, and real rough around the edges. He was not a diplomat. And part of his approach towards governing the Soviet Union, and it's having a major impact on how the satellite countries in Eastern Europe were governed, He went through, he took the country, or he took the whole bloc through a period of de-Stalinization. Not desalinization, taking the salt out, although there could be a parallel there, but de-Stalinization, getting rid of the influence and the teachings of Stalin. And as you know, part of Stalin's legacy was, of course, helping the Allies win World War II and fighting Germany, Italy, and Japan. But he also ruled as a one-party, one-man voice in how the party, the Politburo, took care of its duties. And he set up a series of labor camps that were prisons for people that questioned or did not go along with the narrative, Stalin's narrative. It wasn't a committee of 4 or 5. It wasn't even a Politburo or a party, a group. It was a one-man rule. And so a little quick background, because it can be kind of boring otherwise, but this guy did not have a boring life. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, briefly, was the son of an army officer in Tsarist Russia, pre-1917. And his mother, I believe, was a piano teacher. She had some education. The father died in a hunting accident before the start of World War I, around 1918, but not until not until he had produced a son with his wife. The son, Alexander, was born into a household without a father. The hunting accident was fatal. And the mother, unfortunately, died a couple of years after Alexander was born. And so he went parentless now into the household of an aunt and had a very humble upbringing. He was smart in physics, in mathematics. He wanted to be a teacher. He studied math and physics, science, general sciences up through university. And he always believed in the narrative, the dogma of socialism through communist rule. And unfortunately, and this attitude, this approach was started by Lenin in the 1920s and picked up and actually given steroids by Joseph Stalin, who succeeded Lenin. One of the things was you owned nothing. You contributed to the public good. So that meant a lot of people lost their property. A lot of farmers lost their farms. And through this collectivization, of course, everything went to the state. There was no real private property, and it was a ruthless system. I believe in the Ukraine itself, which was the breadbasket in the eastern part of the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, you had perhaps 5 million people starved to death because what they could grow was taken from them as part of the collective farm movement. And if they had any property or anything, if they were what they call the kulak, which in Russian means fist, if you were a kulak, in other words, if you had a brick house in your village, if you had a 2-story house, if you owned property, if you had people working for you, you employed people and you housed them, all that was forcibly brought into the collective, and the state controlled all those that means of production. So despite that, of course, news of the starvation really didn't reach the West. It certainly wasn't circulated through the Soviet Union because of censorship. Most people didn't even know this happened unless you actually happen to be living there. And letters from people explain or narrating what had happened were often confiscated. They were looked through, and people who complained were through letters or through not much of a phone system, but they were sent to labor camps. And so Solzhenitsyn was not he was a city guy. He went to school. I believe he was going to school in Rostov, which is in southern Russia. And he was doing fairly well. The war broke out with Operation Barbarossa. Kurt, I'm sure you've heard of that. Hitler's move into the Soviet Union to actually squash Bolshevism, which is what communism in the USSR was called. Bolshevism. Bolsheviks were the ones who toppled the Tsar, who was the king, and took charge after, I would say, eliminating 2 to 4 million opponents in the first couple of years of the revolution, 1917 to the turmoil, the chaos, the killing continued up until, I'd say, 1921. Does that sound about right to you, Kurt?
21?
Yeah.
Or 41?
No, I'm talking about the revolution. The initial change.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think it was in 41 that Hitler invaded Russia to crush the Bolsheviks, because he thought, and perhaps it was an eventual consideration of Stalin, that once Stalin's army, his forces were strong enough that they would start a march into German-held provinces or countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc., despite the non-aggression pact that had been signed a couple of years earlier. So you had two people with the same idea: I'll get you before you get me. And only thing is, Hitler thought he was more prepared than Stalin, and Stalin was not quite prepared with a strong enough military. So, and then Hitler, of course, was riding a wave of victories, Netherlands, Belgium. He had Italy with him. France had fallen the year before in 1940. He thought Britain would fall soon. Of course, he was wrong, especially when America started getting involved with Lend-Lease program and later with active military aid, and eventually people. So Solzhenitsyn was drafted. All able men were drafted, so his studies to be a teacher were cut short. 1941, he was an artillery captain, and he was involved in the counteroffensive towards Operation Barbarossa, and starting to push the Germans back, especially after the German defeat in Stalingrad. And it wasn't until the later 40s, in 1944, when practically all of Russia had been freed of German occupation, that Solzhenitsyn started writing in letters to a friend, telling him some of the shortfalls in the logistics, and how he criticized how the war was being fought and the decisions made by the Red Army leaders. And he was a captain, of course. He was not of course, but he was an officer because of his educational background. And unfortunately, all those letters, any letters, that pass through Soviet mail system are read. His letters were read. He was contacted by the secret police in, I believe, February of 45, late January. At that time, the Red Army was going into Prussia, East Prussia. And it was a hell of a time there. Solzhenitsyn writes about his experiences as being part of the Red Army in East Prussia, called Prussian Nights, in which it was a scorch and burn approach, and many things were done in the name of revenge for what the Germans had done while occupying parts of the Soviet Union. The Red Army soldiers and officers were egged on to commit atrocities whenever they came upon German civilians, and of course East Prussia was all German civilians. So he got a call, as I said, or he was picked up and summoned to Moscow in February of 45. They said that he was guilty of treason, and because he mentioned forming a group to look at a different type of government than Joseph Stalin, he was also charged with organizing a treasonous group that would take over. And so for that, the normal penalty was 8 years in a labor camp. And so in July, he was sentenced to 8 years. He had been married for 4 years. He got married just before, in 41, early 41, just before he got into the service. A lot of guys did that. They married their sweethearts before going off to war. They didn't know if they would be coming back. Many didn't. Perhaps half did not come back. And so Alexander Solzhenitsyn was no different. He married, and he was sentenced to 8 years. He stayed in prison till 1953. He worked. His wife divorced him a couple of years before that because you cannot receive state subsidy or you cannot receive employment if you are married to a prisoner of the state. So what wives often did, or spouses, they changed their name and they divorced. They got a divorce through the courts, their husband being serving a prison term in the Gulag. And as you mentioned before, Kurt, Day in the Life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn was drawn from Ivan Denisovich, was drawn from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's experiences during those 8 years of captivity and forced labor in some really inhospitable climate areas, very remote. And so anyway, he wrote. Khrushchev okayed the book because it was against Stalin, and but he didn't want him to write anymore. He continued to write, though, and he won a Nobel Prize in 1970, which was probably the worst thing that could happen to Soviet authorities because now they couldn't easily get rid of him. He could not easily have an accident. He could not easily be suicided. We're seeing that these days. And so what, or we're not. Who knows what's going on. But so he was deported. And he had remarried, and his He had been deported. He thought he was going on a one-way ride. In fact, he was in the plane on the way from Moscow to, he didn't know where. He thought he was going to Vienna because a lot of things happened in Vienna. And he knew some German, and in the plane he was reciting to himself how to say, help, my name is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I'm a novelist, and I want you to know that I'm here. So that people would know that he was there, and he was being escorted by KGB or secret police agents, and that his whereabouts at least would be known before he disappeared. He didn't go to Vienna. Instead, the plane landed in Frankfurt, Germany, and he was welcomed there by Heinrich Böll, who's a German writer, and he had met Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And so he spent some time in Germany. He decided Germany was not really for him. He liked everything being orderly, but I don't know, because of war experiences, but he just didn't want to stay in Germany. He went to Switzerland, and he lived there for 2 years. Now, Kurt, if you're still there, in 1976, he left Switzerland. He was actually, I believe he was in Bern. Where do you think he went after leaving Switzerland?
Ich weiß nicht.
He came to America. He came to America. He did not know a lot of English, but he was encouraged to. He actually gave a speech before Harvard. I don't think it was a graduating class, but he gave a speech before the faculty and student body of Harvard in 1977. But he got there. He came to the United States in 1976, and he wanted to be not so much in the public eye. He wanted to just write. He wanted a quiet place to write. The day in the life of Ivan Denisovich was written during 2 winters he had spent in a wilderness camp in Latvia. Or maybe it was Lithuania, one of the 2 Baltic states. And he did that in the 50s, late 50s. And so he was a seclusion writer, and he actually had a schedule of working or writing from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. And the family would eat together for dinner, but his breakfast and his lunch he would take while writing. He was very serious about writing, prolific writer, as you know. But I wanted to just read a little bit about the Cavendish connection. And I'm reading from a biography by D.M. Thomas. D.M. Thomas. And Thomas spends one chapter, I'm just going to read 2 or 3 pages that deal with his arrival in Cavendish. And again, Cavendish is about 1,000 people. It had a mill that had closed. It has dairy farms, and I believe those have also suffered the passage of time. But it's still there. It's a cute town. I've been through it. It's very pretty. And up on one of the surrounding hills, he bought a house, of course, from proceeds from A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And so this chapter is called A Zone of Quiet. And it starts with a quote, conversation in a library. Hey, aren't you that writer Solzhenitsyn? No, I only look like him. So this was a guy that did not want the limelight. He just wanted to write, be left in peace, be able to fund and send money and help other dissidents in the Soviet Union, because 1976, we're still in the Cold War. It won't be for another 13 years before the Berlin Wall comes down. And we have glasnost, or opening up, through Mikhail Gorbachev, the new premier, who follows Leonid Brezhnev, who's in charge at this time, and Ronald Reagan, who was president in the 80s. Cavendish, in the Black River Valley, surrounded by densely forested mountains, has a becalmed air. Here is the silence, soft glowing light, predictable four seasons, and predictable snow that attracted the exiled writer to it. Its residents live for the most part in neat, clapboard houses. Farmhouses straggle up the lower slopes. The population figure of just over 1,000 has scarcely varied since the Civil War. In the aftermath of that conflict, many French Canadians moved in, bringing a Roman Catholic leavening to the predominantly Protestant English stock. Oh, by the way, Solzhenitsyn was Eastern Orthodox. He was a Christian, okay? And it's interesting that in Russia there's been a resurgence over the last 20 years of religion, Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Polish families came, and some Finns, their origins gradually smudging away in the common destiny of rural, respectable New England. Nothing much ever happened there. Solzhenitsyn's appearance at the community meeting, this was in '76, was the most exciting event since a visit from President Calvin Coolidge in 1928. A native of nearby Plymouth, Coolidge came to look at the extensive damage caused by flooding of the Black River. He arrived a year later, said very little, and left. What do they call him? Silent Cal? Coolidge? The village is evidently the kind of place in which great men say very little. There was not much that humble Cavendish people could say to the reporters, desperate for scraps of news about their famous resident. You don't even know he's here, really. He stays up on his hill. His wife and children always say good morning and wave. They're not bad neighbors, another person said. They keep a nice place. Appreciating the need for privacy, conservative New Englanders knew he had books banned by the evil communists and were happy to give him peace and space. Cavendish folk had not had an urge to ban books since its library board watched solemnly in 1881 a dreadful novel called Camille being ritually burned. Kurt, have you heard of Camille? The story?
No.
Okay. I believe Camille is the story of a female sculptor or sculptress who has a bout of insanity. Anyway, it was kind of 1880s. It was not something that would be put before the public eye. While Russia was experiencing a century of mass deaths, famine, and terror, tiny Cavendish lost just 9 men in the 2 distant world wars. The profound changes taking place were not obvious in the landscape. An affectionate local history makes the point that there were fewer amenities in Cavendish toward the end of the 20th century than at the beginning. It's interesting. That's true of many small towns. The railroad, a century old, no longer has passenger trains, only freight, Green Mountain Railroad. Buses run less conveniently, and it is virtually impossible to live in the village without owning a car. Dairy farming, with which woolen mills and sawmills historically comprised the local economy, had by the mid-1980s, so this was after he had started living there, almost completely died out. The last mill had closed in 1958. Still, Cavendish has not become a ghost village of commuters, perhaps like going to Rutland. if only because of the doubtful virtue that many people are retired. There are many small-time home-based businesses or cottage industries, such as the engraving of guns, the selling of tulip bulbs, weaving, pottery, and a winery. Now, this book was written in '98, this biography on Solzhenitsyn by D.M. Thomas. I understand that Cavendish now has a brewery as well. So Cavendish is with there in a very important 21st century trend. They have their own brewery. There is no local doctor. Increasingly, through satellite dishes and computers, residents belong to a global village as well as a Vermont one. Very true. I think, and Kurt, I'm sure you would probably agree, I think technology in this sense is actually helping villages stay alive by making it possible for people to live in them and not necessarily work there. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And even more since the epidemic. I mean, the trend is trying to work from home, and now that rural areas have access to the internet, that enables them.
That's true. Very true. But still, the prevailing reality of Cavendish is, and I imagine is still today, to quote a title of Robert Bly's A Silence on Snowy Fields. This is what Sanya required. Sanya was the nickname for Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Quiet and lots of light. As his wife told the reporter, he needed nothing else. Her husband insisted he had enough of everything to last him the rest of his life. I can't even persuade him to buy shirts and pants. Completely indifferent to cold, I think that was bred into him through the work camps. Completely indifferent to cold, he could happily work in a cold room. Indifferent to food, too. Again, the labor camps, I'm sure, kept very close track of how much food the workers ate. Indifferent to food, too. He could eat the same thing day in and day out, which I'm sure was what he had been used to for 8 years in the gulags. Very few journalists now were granted an entry into the writer's life. The one American journalist, a freelancer called Andrew Nemethy, who in 1983 drove up the narrow dirt track road through increasingly dense trees to the chain link fence and the electronic surveillance. He really wanted his privacy. Had a feeling of awed privilege. Even had he been working for a more combative magazine than Vermont Life, he would have been unlikely to write anything uncomplimentary. But in any case, the Solzhenitsyns insisted on reading and approving, and where necessary, changing his text. Now I'm going to end there, but I find that's interesting because one of the issues that Solzhenitsyn had was with censorship and control by the government over what he wrote that could be published, certainly over what he could put in a letter, what he could say in a telephone call, even what he said in the privacy of his own home, as I'm sure his apartment was bugged. There were electronic surveillance from KGB because he was an influential person on their radar. But it's interesting that he uses censorship on a much smaller scale to control the information that comes from his side. And he was criticized for that, but I think you have to cut him some slack. He's paranoid because he's been burned so many times. He spent so many times in jail, or so much time in jail, and had been betrayed by friends, people that he thought he could trust. And you get burned enough times, and you become paranoid and very controlling over who approaches you and what you say and what you do. So anyway, I may continue just next week with a few readings from A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, but I just thought it was he's an interesting man, and I hope that in some high school classes, the at least snippets or important passages from his books are now being read and discussed. So, Kurt, I think we're going to tie the knot on this one. Did you have anything to add or any thoughts on what we've been listening to?
Well, they're quite interesting. One thing that it would be nice to continue to pursue was what happened to him. Because it's my understanding he went back to Russia, where he did finally pass away. And from what I recall, I think he was somewhat disenchanted with the United States and its materialism. He had some negative comments, if I recall, about his time here. But I don't know. I don't know. If
I
we'll
think
delve into
you're
that
right.
later, but
Yes, you're right.
he's an interesting man.
I think he had a problem with the materialism because he saw it get in the way of community. The materialism, the constant need to buy something, whether you need it or not, and the pressure, the incredible pressure through media advertising. I think that turned him off because he saw that as damaging to people's spirit, and definitely damaging to the spirit of being a neighbor, being part of a vibrant community that cared for each other. And he had an acute sense of that because he needed some kind of a community, not just where he lived in relative freedom, but on the other side of the chain link fence or the barbed wire where he was kept for 8 years. You needed a small nucleus of people for support. And there are characters that he describes that were serving 25 years in a gulag, and that had reached a state of contentment, almost like a Zen type of state of mind, whereby the physical suffering, the deprivation of not enough food, the cold, the lousy food, the threat from other people, because you had murderers and violent criminals also thrown in with political prisoners. They all shared the same space. And you had to be constantly watching your back. But there was, fortunately, a saving grace of some humanity, even in these dark, dark places. And I think he sees the materialism as a distraction, as superficial, when man is a very deep thinking creature. So I think that's that, if that helps my perspective. And he just lived within a couple of months of turning 90. He died he was born in 1918. He died in 2008, like 3 months short of being 90 years old. Now you imagine his mind, his body, all the torment it went through, the deprivation,
Wow.
the torture, the interrogations that went on for weeks, if not months. It's incredible, the spirit of this man. And he, as you said, he did go back to Russia because he was disenchanted with the materialism of the West and the fact that our democracy was compromised and not quite the model, not quite the institution that it should be to guarantee freedoms. And he left in 98. He left, I want to say he left Cavendish in 94. I'm not sure where he was. I believe he spent some time somewhere else. I forget. My mind's kind of a jumble. But he did spend the last 10 years of his life, 98 to 2008, in Russia, and he died in Moscow in 2008 at the age of almost 90. So, but I'm going to give this some thought, and I like your idea of maybe looking at one or short excerpts to look at some of the character development and portrayal of these people that were really living on another level spiritually and surviving and actually really, really, really incredible. So, Kurt, if you're home, would you give me a call later on? Can you give me a call later on tonight?
Will do.
Yeah, give me a call later on and we'll catch up. But I'm going to say, we're running over. I'm going to say good evening to everyone and thank you for tuning in. I hope you found this interesting and I hope piqued your interest in learning more about this man and his world, his situation, and where we've come from as a country in welcoming dissidents and welcoming people that are oppressed for political reasons. So, anyway, wish you all a good weekend. God bless. And again, next week's program, 5:45 Thursday, is going to be pre-recorded. So again, thanks again, and have a good rest of your week. Bye-bye.
Spasiba. Do svidania.
До свидания.